Several years ago, I wrote an article that I titled, "Three Things That Evolutionists Don't Want You to Know." And recently that article has come back to my attention. Well, it never left my attention, but it was brought up to me. And a conversation that basically reminded me that it is something that needs to be discussed maybe somewhat regularly. It's something that doesn't go out of the point where we can stop talking about it. And it's something that needs to be brought up, and I think we're coming to a point, or we're at a point where it really, really needs to be discussed. That is the question of origins and basically what is the explanation for why we're here? How we're here, not why we're here, but how we're here. And the purpose of that article was to point out three things. I put it in sermon format and changed that to 4 things. In fact, the original article was 5 things, but I took it down to 3 and sort of settled it in the middle for 4. But basically, when we talk about the question of origins, there are both sides that know anything about anything agree that there are only 2 options. And whenever there are only 2 options, that's a tremendous benefit in anything, really, but especially in something like this. There are 2 possible paths of belief that somebody can take. One is that there is a supreme, superior being or beings that oversee the universe. And the other is that, basically, that the first one is wrong. That's basically what the number 2 option is, that there is no superior, supreme, intelligent being overseeing the universe. This is the fork in the road that everybody has you got to choose one of them. And this is arguably the most important thing that you choose in life, because it determines everything else, the way you look at everything, the way you look at the world, which will include the way you look at Jesus, the way you look at the Scriptures, the way you look at everything. Which one of these 2 paths you believe. And really, bound up in that worldview is the explanation of the origin for all things. And in this also there are 2 possibilities, only 2. And this is what both sides will agree on, that when it comes to the origins of all things, there are only 2 possibilities. Supernatural, that's what we believe, or I hope anyway. That is that an intelligent designer created everything and is the explanation for how we exist. Supernatural explanation. Then there's the natural explanation. And it has recently, like I said, been brought to my attention how important this is, because I learned for the first time in the last month or so that even the Catholic Church has apparently gotten to the point where they are denying the literal view of the book of the first chapter of Genesis. And maybe that has been the Catholic view for a long time. I just didn't know. I didn't know that. But as strongly as they might stand on some issues, like abortion and things like that, even they are caving under the pressure of the so-called scientific elite, the white lab coats, as I call them, saying and indoctrinating all these people with that what they say is a scientific fact, that evolution, as it's called, is a scientific fact, and we have proof of it. Well, if you're like me, I don't know anything about science in that field of science, and I don't know anybody who does. I don't know anybody who's a biologist or a biochemist or anything like that, or whatever else you might need to be. So who am I to say that they don't know what they're talking about? However, there are some things that they don't tell. They tell you a bunch of things that they shouldn't tell because they don't have proof, but there are some things that they don't tell. But before we even look at those things, there is a crucial point that we have to understand. one of these two things that you see on the screen has to be correct. Sometimes we have two possibilities, and there are really three possibilities. One is that one of them's right, two is that the other one's right, and three is that neither one of them's right. Sometimes that's the case. But with this question, one of those two has to be true. One of these two is correct. And that is the thing that I've mentioned, that both sides that are knowledgeable anyway, that are honest enough to admit it, one of them is the correct explanation. There's no third option, and there's no option that neither one of them is correct. One of them has to be. Well, whenever we understand that one of them has to be right, one of the things that we can do is show how one of them is impossible. And that leaves us with the right answer. If it's true that either one of these two options that must be true is impossible, then we can be 100% positive that the other one is correct, without even having to prove that that's the answer, if the other one's impossible. And this is where we come to the question here of things that they don't want you to know. Atheist, I changed the name to atheist instead of evolutionist, but because they often go hand in hand, evolutionary atheists or atheistic evolutionists, however you want to look at it, there are things that they don't want you to know because these things absolutely prove that what they say is the explanation for origins is impossible. It proves it to be totally impossible, and therefore these things prove that divine creation is the explanation for origins. Now, all of us here may not need to know these four things. It may be that, well, the Bible says it, and that's enough for me. Okay, well, that's fair enough. But that's not going to help you to convince anybody that divine creation is the truth. There are things that you can look at and point to that prove it, however. Even though the burden of proof is usually on the opponent of Scripture, there are these things that we can look at. And really what we're talking about is this concept of organic evolution. And what that means is life originally arose from billions of years ago from one single-celled organism that formed somehow after slow cooking in this old plasmic stew of some kind over a period of millions of years. Now, to us, that probably sounds ridiculous. But to those who are not aware, it sounds, whenever you got people that have all these titles after their name and all these initials and all, they're standing in the front of the class in the university or whatever, and they have all these degrees and master's degrees and doctorates and all these things saying this is a scientific fact. Young people are intimidated by this, and many not young people are intimidated by this. But if they knew these things, these four things, they might have a different outlook. And these things you will never hear from an evolutionist or an atheist or anybody who says that the Bible is false or silly or, fable, fiction. You'll never hear these things. They're swept under the rug. They tell you what they want you to hear, and they don't tell you what they don't want you to hear, even if the thing they don't want you to hear happens to be true. And that's not honest, and it's not sincere, and it's frankly evil whenever you have an ulterior motive of trying to prove to people or get people to believe that God is not real. So, what are these four things? Let's look at these. Number one, atheists don't want you to know, evolutionists don't want you to know that the dating methods that they use are inherently flawed. If you've looked far enough, you will have found somewhere something that was discovered that they say, we know that this thing is 100,000 years old. We dated it with scientific dating methods. We have used our highly intricate scientific dating methods to confirm that this thing, this rock, this bone, whatever it is 100,000 years old or a couple million years old. And we know it. It's a fact. What they don't tell you is that the dating methods that they use, and there are several different ones, they are flawed. And being flawed, they are useless, utterly useless for dating something. One of the dating methods they use, and I don't want to get into too much detail because, frankly, it makes my head hurt. And if it makes my head hurt, it'll probably make your head hurt, me trying to talk about it. So one of them that they use, as simply as I can put it, because I need it to be simplified for my own sake, they're based on decay rates of certain elements in the rocks. So rocks have multiple different elements in them. They date these things by the decay rate. And basically what they do is, well, we measure how much of this certain element there is, and relative to this other element, we determine how long it would take for that element to come down to that amount. It used to have this much, but now it has this much, and we determine how long it would take for it to go from this to this, and therefore we know how old it is, or at least how old it is. What the problem here is that their equations they use are incomplete, and they require assumptions. And anytime you have a mathematical equation that requires assumptions, it's worth nothing. Remember those questions on tests that you may have had that were incomplete, and it's a trick question, basically. It's like, Billy has 4 apples. Sally took 3 of his apples. How many apples does Sally have? It's not a complete question, is it? You know why? Because it didn't tell us how many apples Sally had to begin with. She may have had 20 apples. So then she would have 23. But what if she had none? Well, then she would have 3. But you don't know because you don't have all the information. That's how these dating methods work. They don't know certain things that they have to know in order for their dating method to even work. And therefore, they can't have a result from it. The margin of error is so massive because of the assumptions. They have to fill in the blanks. No result that dating method comes up with can be trusted because you have no way of knowing exactly what they're saying they know. And beyond that, the dating methods have been proven to be unreliable by dating things that they knew how old it was. Like, for instance, I don't know if this was a specific thing that actually happened, but just as an illustration, an elephant skeleton that they have record of when that elephant died and was buried. I know that is something that actually happened. I don't remember. I may be mixing 2 different examples. But there was a case where they knew there was a woman that was still alive that was alive when that elephant died. And it was something like that was dated to be so many thousands of years older than it actually was. Well, as soon as that happens, it doesn't matter what number these dating methods come up with. You can't trust it. In other words, they can't be proven to be right. So if this one was proven to be wrong, here was the argument that was put to me in this recent conversation. That was just one that was proven wrong. But what about all the ones that were not wrong? Well, you know what the answer to that is? How do you know they weren't wrong? The only proof we have is that is the one that's wrong. How do you know that the other ones weren't wrong? Just because you don't know how old the skeleton was doesn't mean that the dating was right. It was probably just as wrong as the elephant one was. And different things like that. Like I said, I blended 2 examples. It was more of I think a rock from a volcano that was one of the other ones that was debunked. But the point is, their dating methods are flawed, and they don't tell you that. They don't want people to know that they have to fill in these gaps that totally make their equation useless. In other words, well, this rock has 10% uranium, so how long would it take it to get to 10%? Well, they don't know how much. They don't know what it had before, so they have no way of the way they determine the decay rate. They don't even have the complete picture. So their dating methods are useless. So anytime they say this thing is this old, totally useless. And they don't want you to know that. Number 2, they don't want you to know that there is evidence that proves that humans and dinosaurs lived together. Or, at the very least, there is evidence that suggests that humans and dinosaurs lived on the earth at the same time. Now, if there is evidence that shows that, why wouldn't they want people to know that? That's what science should do, right? So why would they keep that hidden? Because they don't like it goes against their theory, their idea. So they don't want you to know that, even though it exists. I thought science was supposed to be all about finding the evidence wherever it leads, you know. That is what science is, by the way. That's what science actually is. What they do is not science, which kind of spoiled the later points. But anyway, all over the world, there have been ancient artworks discovered that clearly depict dinosaurs. Well, they're extremely accurate. We know that because we have since found dinosaur skeletons that have been, some of them preserved very put together for different circumstances. And you look back at some of the ones that they've reconstructed, and these artworks that they found on cave walls and in figurines even, turns out to be extremely accurate. Well, okay, so what? They probably saw the skeletons. Nope, they didn't. Because the first fossilized dinosaur skeleton wasn't even discovered until the middle 1800s. Well, if the first dinosaur skeleton, fossilized skeleton, wasn't discovered until 1856, barely 150 years ago or so, how did those ancient artists know so precisely what those creatures looked like? How did they know? Blind luck? They just made it up in their head and it just happened to look exactly like this certain dinosaur that they found a skeleton of? There's only a few answers to this question, you know. The obvious one seems to be they knew what it looked like because they had seen it. Somebody had seen it. And even if it wasn't the person that drew it or fashioned it, the point is that somebody did. Somebody had seen it. They knew what it looked like. Which proves that man and dinosaur coexisted. So there is evidence that suggests that. Now, that sounds ridiculous if you take for granted that the earth, dinosaurs died 65 million years ago. But that's just something that people made up. It's cool for Jurassic Park, you know. Great movie. Classic. I love it. But it's based on total nonsense. There is evidence that suggests that man and dinosaur coexisted. So even though you'd be laughed at if you said that. If you said that dinosaurs and man lived together, a lot of people laugh at you. But there's evidence. More evidence than the contrary, for sure. Number 3, science proved, here's one they really don't want you to know. Science proved that organic evolution is scientifically impossible over 100 years ago. Science. There's a key word there. Science proved that. Not the Bible, not some Christian, not some preacher, not some activist. Science proved that. Science proved that evolution is scientifically impossible over 100 years ago. That's devastating. Here's how it happened. In 1862, there was a French chemist and bacteriologist named Louis Pasteur. You may have heard of him before. If not, you've probably heard of him from me before because I use this a lot because of how important it is. Well, one of the things that his legacy was the establishment, and I put establishment in quotation marks because he didn't really establish it, he just sort of discovered it or confirmed it. It's a scientific law called biogenesis. And what biogenesis means is that life can come only from pre-existing life and after its own kind. That's a scientific law. And what a scientific law is, what distinguishes that, is that it is something that happens in nature that absolutely cannot be broken. Cannot be broken. Now, there are scientific hypotheses, there are scientific theories, but a scientific law cannot be broken at all, no matter what. And Louis Pasteur established or discovered the scientific law of biogenesis. And how that happened is he disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. You ever heard of spontaneous combustion? Something that spontaneously blows up. Spontaneous meaning just out of nowhere all of a sudden, just blows up. Well, spontaneous generation is the same thing, except instead of exploding, it's becoming in existence. Spontaneous generation, that this life form can just suddenly appear or come from, maybe not even suddenly, but come from a non-living thing. Well, the disproving of spontaneous generation is so important because spontaneous generation has to have occurred for evolution to be viable. It depends on it. So if there is scientific proof that spontaneous generation does not occur, then why do people say it did occur? Well, yeah, it doesn't occur now, but it did occur then. How do you know? How do you know what occurred 1 billion years ago? But they have to say it did, because here's how it works. We're here, so it has to happen. That's not science. That's just fantasy. Louis Pasteur proved that the scientific alternative for the origin of all things is actually scientifically impossible. That should be the end of the debate. It should be over. But it's not. Because even though this is true, there are those who don't want to accept it. So they either sweep it under the rug or they make up something else like, well, no, it doesn't happen. Louis Pasteur proves that it doesn't happen now. He didn't prove that it didn't happen then. Well, if it doesn't happen now, then why do you think it happened then? Which leads into this last thing. It's basically the same point. I guess I could have called it 3 things. Although there is a distinction, which we'll see. Atheists don't want you to know that the scientific alternative to divine creation is unscientific. It is actually not science. Not only Louis Pasteur proved that spontaneous generation doesn't happen, can't happen, but it's actually not even science. The alternative, the scientific alternative. You know, this is how they got creation out of the school systems. About 100 years ago, they said it's not right to teach creation alone. Evolution ought to be taught next to it. That went to court and it won. They won. So then they started teaching creation and evolution next to each other. Now, if we took that to today, I'd be okay with that personally. I'll be okay with them teaching those two side by side. You know why? Because evolution is going to be made to look like nonsense every time. I tried teaching a young kids class, and not really little kids, but middle school age kids several years ago in Bible class about evolution. And I realized it's very hard because it doesn't make any sense. So I thought I was making these very profound points, and the kids were like, that's stupid. Why would somebody need to be told that? It's dumb. I mean, obvious. It's common sense. And I was thinking, well, you would think it is, but apparently it's not, because so many people believe it. So really, the way it works is the scientific alternative is not even scientific. Going back to how they got it out of the school systems, once evolution and creation were taught together, now all of a sudden a few years go by and they decide it's not right to teach creation at all next to evolution. Because, here was the argument, because creation is not scientific. So creation shouldn't be taught in science class because it's not scientific. And guess what? They won. So they took creation out of science class. Well, you know what you're effectively doing if you take creation out of science class? You're taking creation out of the elementary school system. Because there's suddenly where are you going to teach creation? They don't have Bible classes anymore in public school. Far from it. So you take creation out of science class, you've taken creation out of school. And the argument was, it's not scientific. Well, guess what? Turns out that the scientific alternative is also not scientific. It's not science at all. What is science anyway? Besides one of the subjects that I loathed in school, not near as bad as math. I'll take science over math any day, but I don't want either one of them. But science is a English word that comes from a Latin word for knowledge. That's what it means. It means knowledge. One dictionary said it's a system of knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through scientific method. There's a key word, tested. Another said it's a systematic enterprise that builds knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. That's what science is, okay? It's a systematic enterprise that builds knowledge in the form of testable explanations. See the pattern in these two definitions, independent from one another? Test. You have to be able to test it, whatever it is. You've got to be able to test it. That is a fundamental part of what science is. So we ask the question then, is evolution a scientific law? Some classrooms will say yes, it is. Probably especially on college campuses. It's a scientific law, they'll say. Remember, scientific law can't be broken. Well, what is a scientific law? Scientific law is a statement based on repeated experimental observations that describes some aspect of the universe. You take something in your hand and you drop it. You know what's going to happen? You know what's going to happen. You don't even have to try it, you know. But you know what the point is? That you can try it. You can do it. And every single time you do it, the same thing is going to happen. You can stand here for 100 years if you live that long and keep doing it, and every single time you do it, the same thing is going to happen, isn't it? That thing is going to hit the floor, unless it's a balloon filled with helium. But that doesn't count. If it's something besides that, and even that will eventually fall to the floor, you know why? Because gravity is a scientific law, or whatever the technical name is. That's a scientific law. You know why? You could observe it every single time. Well, it hits the floor every time, based on repeated experimental observations that describe some aspect of the universe. So that is one of those things. Well, since the atheistic version of origins dates from supposedly billions of years ago, it's never been observed. How could it have been? So why did evolution ever become a hypothesis in the first place if it's based on something that's never been observed? Have you ever thought about that? This whole thing about this Big Bang and then, you know, the first single-celled organism that came from something that was really nothing. How did that ever come to be? By the way, I didn't really explain Louis Pasteur. What he did was they started determining or realizing, observing that when you leave meat out, raw meat, it becomes infested with maggots. And they thought, that's strange. That's interesting. So he wanted to figure out what in the world's going on. And you know what one of his hypotheses was the maggots are spontaneously generating from the raw meat. So he started doing tests. And he proved that his hypothesis was incorrect. And no, the maggots do not come from the dead meat. The way he determined that was he put one underwater, left it out overnight, and the other one he left out in the open overnight. The one that was in the open was infested with maggots. The one that was under the water was not. So he determined they are not, that was just this simplified version. Spontaneous generation does not occur. Life comes only from other living things. Never can come from a dead thing or a non-living thing. That's biogenesis. That is how the scientific method usually works, or does always only works. Well, one thing is certain. Evolution is not a scientific law. This is a scientific law. Evolution can't be that. Well, okay, is evolution a scientific theory? That's a step down from law. Is it a scientific theory? How many times do we call it the theory of evolution? I've tried to break that from my vocabulary. Another spoiler. But the defining characteristic of scientific knowledge is the ability to make falsifiable or testable predictions. That's the difference between knowledge and scientific knowledge. It has to be able to make falsifiable or testable predictions. Whatever your prediction is has to be falsifiable, which means you can test it and prove that it's false or not, just like Louis Pasteur did. If you can't do that, it can't be a scientific theory. Well, evolution can't do that. How can you test and how can it be falsifiable that we arose from a single-celled organism over 1 billion years ago? How can you test that? What are you testing? What is that? So, can evolution be a theory? Of course it can. But it cannot be a scientific theory. People have all kinds of theories, crazy ones. Most of these people are not mentally well, to be frank, to be honest. Elvis lives in my closet. I'm pretty sure a woman once thought Tabby was pregnant with Jesus or something, something like that. I mean, that's not a joke. She actually did or something. Or she thought she was pregnant with her baby or something like that. That's a theory. Yeah, sure. It's not a scientific theory. But you know what? Ironically, it's more scientific than evolution, because once that baby came out, you could do a DNA test and prove that it's not her baby. So, see, that's even more scientific, even though it still doesn't quite classify as a scientific theory. Evolution cannot be a scientific theory. So something that cannot be a scientific theory, isn't it strange that they go ahead and say it's a fact? Can't even be a theory. In fact, for the same reason, it can't even be a scientific hypothesis, because a hypothesis has to be based on observation. You remember learning the scientific method in school? It hasn't changed, I don't think, or it shouldn't, because it's always the same. Scientific method. Here's how it works when Louis Pasteur did it, and I just went through this. Here was his, first he got an observation. Observation, the raw meat becomes infested with maggots when it's left out. That's a legitimate observation. So, next step is questions. Where are these maggots coming from? From what do they arise? And so many other questions. Then you got your hypothesis. His was that the source of the maggots is the raw meat, or that they are spontaneously generating from the meat. That's his hypothesis. So then he put it to the test in the way that I explained. He did other tests too, but the one that really did it for him was the one submerged underwater and the one not submerged underwater. One of them had it, the other one didn't. That was his test. So the results of the test was that, and the conclusion then was the dead meat is not the source of the living maggot. In other words, there's no spontaneous generation occurring. That is true science right there. He had his observation, he made questions, he had a hypothesis, tested the hypothesis, proved his experiments, his tests proved that his hypothesis was not correct. Now, I don't know if he ever found out what actually is creating the maggots. We know in hindsight, those pesky old flies. But what he proved is that spontaneous generation was not occurring. And thanks to his work, we know it can't occur because life can come only from pre-existing life. Here's how the scientific method would work if you applied it to evolution. And if you can't apply the scientific method to it, it's not science. That's just a fact. So here's the observation. Life is. There are living things. Quite a profound observation. So questions. How did life come to exist? Hypothesis. Life arose from non-living matter billions of years ago. Well, here we have a problem as far as the scientific method is concerned, because your hypothesis has to be testable, has to be falsifiable. How can you falsify something that you're saying happened billions of years ago? You can't. There's another one. Another problem is that hypothesis already contradicts an established law of science that Louis Pasteur proved. Okay, tests. None. Sorry, can't test. Big problem there. Results. Well, if I don't have tests, I can't have results. Big problem there. So the conclusion, Life arose from non-living matter billions of years ago. That's convenient, isn't it? We'll just go ahead and skip all the science part. In our scientific alternative, we'll skip the science and we'll just go straight from our hypothesis to our conclusion. That is not science. Anybody else did that, they would be mocked out of the room. It would be uproar, chaos. And yet this is the way it is. It's not science. This is not science. Evolution is not science. It is, if anything, history. History for which there is no evidence and for which there is no proof. But it still belongs to history, not science. Evolutionists don't want you to know that. They just tell you that it's a scientific fact. And they bombard you, and not just you, but people who are much more impressionable and much more prone to peer pressure and giving in. The younger they can start indoctrinating them, the better for them. And then they'll just grow up learning this is a scientific fact, just like gravity. Except they don't tell you it's nothing like gravity, because gravity is something that you can observe and you do every day. The fact that you're walking on the ground is proof of it. Everything is. Evolutionists don't want you to know that their scientific alternative is not scientific. Science proves it to be impossible. That's the irony. You don't need the Bible to prove creation to be true. The Bible says it is. But you know what the most ironic thing is? The Bible, the account of creation in the book of Genesis, is actually more scientific than the theory of evolution. There, I said it again. The concept of evolution. The fantasy of evolution. It's actually more scientific. You know what you'll read several times in Genesis 1? After its kind. After its kind. After its kind. That's exactly what the law of biogenesis, scientific law of biogenesis. God created this, and it arose and continued after its kind. That's science, and that's the Bible. Evolution says life can come from non-living things and become eventually totally different things. So again, remember we started, there are only two possible explanations. We have just seen that the natural explanation is utterly impossible. It's unscientific, it's unfalsifiable, it's untestable, it can't be science. That leaves us with only one. Even if I can't go back in time and prove, look, I can't show you a glass ball, a crystal ball, and let you see God create the universe. I can't do that. But I can prove to you that the only other alternative is utterly impossible. And since there are only two, now there's only one. If scientists would actually say this, a lot fewer people would believe in that nonsense. If they were honest. I believe this, but the evidence is questionable, but I still believe it. That's not very convincing, is it? But you know what? It's true. That's the truth. So they should present it as the truth. But they don't. They don't want you to know these things, and they certainly don't want your children and grandchildren to know these things, because they want your children and grandchildren to believe that God is not real, and that therefore there is no God. There's no standard of living. We're just here. Who knows why in the world we're here? Life is just a joke, an accident. And as an accident, you can do whatever you want. Nobody can tell you otherwise. These are the moral and logical consequences of this, which is why we need to educate ourselves and know how to combat it. Again, just saying the Bible says this isn't enough anymore. It's not enough. It may be enough for me, and with a lot of things that works. All it takes is one verse for the Bible to say that this is the way it is, and then that, for me, that's enough, because I respect the Bible. But to convince other people who have been brainwashed, we need to know what we're talking about. And these four things are things that people need to consider, and that it may blow their minds. They may not believe it, but I bet it'll plant a seed and they'll want to look into it. What do you mean? But the thing about the scientific method, there's nothing to look into. Here's the scientific method. I dare you to apply evolution to that. Apply this method, scientific method, to evolution. They won't be able to do it. And that could plant a seed. Maybe it's not science after all. But what science does say is perfectly in harmony with the Bible. The Bible is not anti-science. I'm a man of science, and you're a man of faith. Nonsense. They're not mutually exclusive. The Bible never contradicts a law of science. Men's interpretation has. And I just heard it recently, the claim again that the Bible says that the sun revolves around the earth. It's not true. Now, men used to say that the Bible said that, but they were wrong. They misinterpreted that verse. The circuit of the sun, they misinterpreted that. And probably because of a translational error. But no, the Bible, truthfully, never contradicts science. It's in perfect harmony with it. Evolution contradicts science. The Bible doesn't. People need to know the truth, and that truth begins with there is a God, and we came from that God. And we are here because He put us here. And this planet is the home that He created. And once we start opening our minds, that's whenever these things we realize they're silly. Like, obviously this is the case. Look at all the other planets, even in our solar system. It's obvious. There's nowhere else for us. Why is this planet so perfect? Certainly not by an accident. Can't be. It's illogical. It's lunacy. Well, first we need to be convinced. We need to know why we believe what we believe. Then we can help other people know the truth. These are things that people need to hear today, frankly, these things. They don't want you to know, and so all the more reason for you to know. Don't be intimidated. Everything that they declare is totally made up from their own imaginations, and it's all for the motive of disproving the existence of God and being the God of their own lives. That's all they want. So that's their whole purpose in life. Well, we know that God exists, but we may still be trying to live our own lives, be the God of our own lives. We need to fight those urges and always seek to mold ourselves to God's will